The letter landed on the table between them like a verdict. Alma Brenner stood in the doorway of the Ashford ranch house with her jaw tight and her eyes burning, and she said nothing for a long moment because the words she needed were somewhere behind the betrayal clawing up her throat. She had found it tucked inside the grain ledger she had been meaning to return. A single folded paper, written in Ezekiel Ashford's precise, unhurried hand, addressed to the land office in Harlan County. She had not meant to read it. She had read every word. "You told them I was struggling." Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was worse than if she had shouted. "You told the land office that the Brenner claim was in distress, that the widow was unlikely to meet her 6-month filing requirements." Ezekiel did not flinch. He stood near the fireplace with his hat in his hands, watching her the way he watched everything, with that unbearable patience that had been confusing her for 3 months. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck from working outdoors, and he had the kind of face that kept its secrets well. Right now that face was giving her nothing. "I also told them," he said, "that you had made significant improvements to the property and that your claim was valid." "That is not the point." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't. The point is that you were watching me. The point is that everything I did out there, every fence post I drove, every water line I tried to dig, every bag of seed I hauled from town, somehow you already knew about it before I finished. You showed up the next morning with the tools I needed. You appeared at the exact moment the work was half done. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself you were just being neighborly." She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "But you wrote to the land office. You were tracking my progress. You knew exactly how close I was to failing." The fire crackled. Outside, the New Mexico wind pushed against the window glass with a low, persistent sound. "I knew," Ezekiel said carefully, "how close you were to succeeding." That stopped her. The silence between them stretched like wire pulled too tight, and Alma felt the anger she had carried through the 2-mile walk to his ranch begin to shift into something more complicated, something that frightened her more than the anger had. She had spent 3 months telling herself she did not need Ezekiel Ashford. She had spent 3 months being wrong. It was the autumn of 1883 in the territory of New Mexico, and Alma Brenner had arrived in Cibola Flats in July with $42, a wagon, and the deed to 160 acres of dry, difficult land that her late husband Daniel had filed on under the Homestead Act before a fever took him in April. The land was hers by law. Keeping it was another matter entirely. Daniel Brenner had been a gentle man and a poor planner, and Alma had loved him with the patient, practical love of a woman who understood that love was not always fire. It was sometimes just the steady decision to remain. She had remained beside him through 7 years in St. Louis, through 2 years of his talking about the West, through his filing on the claim and his dying before he ever saw it. She had remained after he was gone, sitting in a boarding house in Santa Fe for 2 months, trying to determine whether she had enough courage to go out there alone and make it real. She had decided she did. She was 27 years old and she had no family left to go back to, and she had her husband's dream folded in her coat pocket like a piece of paper worth keeping, and she went. The Brenner claim sat at the edge of the Cibola Flats Basin, a stretch of high desert grassland crossed by a seasonal creek and bordered on the north by the Ashford Ranch, which was the largest operation in the county. She had not known that when she arrived. She had not known much of anything about her neighbors when she pulled her wagon down the rutted track that led to the small adobe structure Daniel had arranged to have built by proxy before his death. The structure was standing, which surprised her. The well was dry, which did not. She had met Ezekiel Ashford on her 3rd day. She had been on her hands and knees beside the well, measuring the depth with a knotted rope, trying to determine whether the dry season had simply lowered the water table or whether the well had been dug in the wrong location entirely. She heard a horse and looked up, and there he was, sitting easy in the saddle on a bay mare, watching her with those quiet dark eyes. "Alma Brenner," he said, which startled her because she had not told anyone her name out here yet. "That's right," she said and stood up, because she was not the kind of woman who stayed on her knees when a man rode up. "Ezekiel Ashford. My northern boundary line runs about a quarter-mile that way." He tilted his head. "Your well's in Kalichi. You won't hit water at that depth." "How deep would I need to go?" he thought for a moment. 40 feet thereabouts, maybe 45. She looked down at the rope in her hands. The well was already 16 feet deep. She had exactly enough money left to buy seed and fence wire. "Thank you for the information," she said. He nodded, touched his hat brim, and rode away. She told herself later that she should have asked him more questions that day. But at the time she had been focused on not letting him see how close she was to despair. And by the time she thought of questions she wanted to ask, he was already a moving shape against the brown distance. The first time he helped her finish something, she did not know he had done it. She had spent an entire day hauling rocks from the dry creek bed, building a rough retaining wall along the south edge of the property where runoff was cutting away the soil. It was brutal work, and she was not quite strong enough to lift the largest stones alone, so she had been rolling them and wedging them into place with a long-handled spade. By evening she had completed perhaps a third of what she needed. She went to bed exhausted and certain that the project would take another week. In the morning the wall was finished. She stood at her door and stared at it for a long time. The upper stones had been set with a precision she had not achieved in the section she had built herself, and there was a drainage notch cut into the base at exactly the spot she had been meaning to add one. She walked the length of it twice, running her hand along the surface. Every stone was set. The work was clean. She asked around in town. Nobody knew anything. The family at the neighboring claim to the south, the Garcias, said they had heard nothing in the night. There was no explanation she could find, and eventually she added it to the category of things she did not understand and kept moving. The second time, she knew something was happening but still could not prove it. She had been digging a drainage channel from the low side of her property toward the creek, trying to direct the rainwater before it pooled around the foundation of the adobe. It was a project she had mapped out carefully, marking the line with stakes and a length of string, calculating the grade by eye and feel. She had dug about 40 feet of the 60 she needed when her back gave out. Not dramatically, just the kind of slow seizing that came from too many days of too much work, and she had gone inside and eaten and slept for 14 hours. When she went out the next morning, the remaining 20 feet had been dug. The grade was right. The stakes were still in the ground, but the string was coiled neatly beside the last one, as though whoever had finished did not want to presume to remove her markers. She stood at the end of the channel for a long time. Then she picked up the coiled string and walked to her wagon and drove the 2 miles to the Ashford ranch. That had been this morning. She had stopped in his barn to return the grain ledger she had borrowed 2 weeks ago when her own had gotten wet in a rainstorm, and she had found the letter while she was setting the ledger on his work table, and she had read it, and then she had come inside and put it on the table between them. And now she was here in this firelit room, and Ezekiel was looking at her with that unreadable patience, and he had just said he knew how close she was to succeeding, and she did not know what to do with that. "How long?" she asked. "How long have I been watching out for you? How long have you been finishing my work?" He was quiet for a moment. He set his hat on the mantel, which she noticed because it was a small gesture of settling in, of not running from this conversation. "Since the second week," he said. "The rock wall, that was you." "Yes." "And the drainage channel." "Yes." "What else?" He met her eyes. "The fence on the east quarter. You had driven about half the posts, and I could see from my side that the ground got harder past the ridge. I came back with a different bit and finished it. I thought I had misjudged the soil." "You hadn't. You just needed a sharper tool." Alma pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, not to stop tears, but to stop the sound that wanted to come out of her, something between a laugh and a sob, something she had no name for. She breathed through it and brought her hand down. "The seeds," she said. "The bag of winter rye that appeared on my porch." "Yes." The water, she stopped. Ezekiel, my well. I woke up 3 weeks ago and the water was running. He said nothing. Did you re-drill my well? I had a crew come from the South Ranch. We took 2 days. We told them it was a practice project for new hands. A pause. We worked nights so we wouldn't disturb you. Alma felt the full weight of it settle over her. Not just the scale of it, the labor, the planning, the secrecy, but the why beneath it, which she was only now beginning to understand and which frightened her more than anything else in the last 3 months had, because she had been frightened by hard work and cold nights and dry soil, and the silence of a land that did not care whether she survived. She knew how to be frightened by those things. She did not know how to be frightened by kindness. Why would you do that? Her voice was almost steady. I am not your responsibility. My claim is not your land. You have your own work, more work than most men could manage. I have seen your operation. Why would you spend your nights finishing a stranger's fences? Ezekiel picked up his hat from the mantel and turned it once in his hands, then set it back down. He looked at her for a long moment and she saw something move behind his eyes, something that was not the careful patience he usually showed the world. You weren't a stranger, he said. Not after the first day. The fire cracked. Alma did not move. You were on your knees beside that well, he said, measuring the depth with a rope you had knotted yourself every 6 inches, and you were not crying. You were measuring. You had clearly been there for hours and you were not crying, you were calculating. I have watched a lot of people come out to this land and fail, and I have watched a lot of them cry before they failed, and you were not doing any of that. You were just figuring out what the problem was so you could solve it. He stopped. I thought about you the whole ride home. I thought about you the next day, and the day after that. Alma looked at him. That is not an answer to my question, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. It is the only answer I have that is honest. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark land. The moon was up, throwing its flat silver light across the basin, and she could see the pale line of the mountains to the north, massive and indifferent and beautiful. The letter to the land office, she said. I wrote to tell them you were making progress. I wrote because I knew you were going to meet your deadlines and I wanted there to be a record that you were doing the work. In case someone tried to challenge your claim. Someone like who? A beat. Earl Cutter. She turned from the window. Earl Cutter was the name she had heard twice in town, always in the same tone, the tone people used for problems they had given up expecting to solve. He owned the Cutter operation to the east, 3,000 acres of grazing land, and there was a general understanding in Cibola Flats that he wanted more and was not particular about how he got it. He's been watching my claim, she said. It was not quite a question. He has been watching every small claim in the basin for 2 years. He challenged the Garcia homestead last spring. They held on, but it cost them everything they had in legal fees. Ezekiel's voice was steady. Your claim is the last unanchored parcel between his eastern fence and the creek access. If you fail to meet your homestead requirements, the land reverts, and he will file on it within the week. Alma absorbed this. The dark past of this land, the hidden motives beneath the surface courtesy of men like Cutter, the trap that had been set for her without her knowledge, simply by being a widow alone on a small claim in a place where powerful men wanted water access. She had walked into it without knowing it existed. You should have told me, she said. I know. I had a right to know what I was walking into. You did. I was wrong not to tell you sooner. He looked at her directly. I was afraid that if you knew how dangerous it was, you would leave, and I did not want you to leave. The honesty of that landed on her like something physical. She gripped the windowsill behind her. Ezekiel, I know what it sounds like. It sounds like you made a decision that was mine to make. Yes, I did. He did not excuse it. I am sorry for that, not for helping, but for withholding the Cutter information. That was wrong. She looked at him for a long time. The firelight moved across his face, and she watched it the way she had been secretly watching him for 3 months, without letting herself name what she was doing. The shape of his hands. The way he spoke slowly without waste. The way he had stood at the edge of her property line once and watched her work and then quietly turned and ridden away without interrupting her, and she had somehow known he was there and somehow not minded. "Why didn't you just offer to help me outright?" she asked. "Why the secrecy? Why not just ride up and say, 'I would like to help you, would you accept it?'" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you would have said no." She opened her mouth and then closed it again. "You would have said no," he repeated gently. "And you would have been right to say it. You came out here alone to do something alone, and your dignity was bound up in doing it. If I had ridden up and offered charity, you would have sent me home." He paused. "So I waited until dark." Alma felt something break open in her chest, not in the painful way, or not only in the painful way, in the way of a door that had been kept shut for too long finally giving way. "I am not a woman who accepts charity," she said, but the argument felt hollow now, felt like a line she had rehearsed for a person who had never actually appeared. "I know you're not." He crossed the room. Not quickly. Ezekiel Ashford had never done anything quickly in her presence. He moved with the same deliberate quiet that he brought to everything, and he stopped about 2 feet from her, which was close enough that she could see the particular dark of his eyes in the firelight. "What I did was not charity. I want you to understand that." "Then what was it?" "It was what you do for someone you care about. You finish the work." Alma looked at him, and the truth of the last 3 months reorganized itself in her mind. All the moments she had catalogued and set aside because she did not know where to put them. The way he had always happened to be passing when she was in town and had always carried the heavy things to her wagon without being asked. The way he had once repaired her wagon wheel while she was inside the general store without mentioning it, and she had only noticed because the wobble was gone. The way he had sent his foreman to tell her about the approaching cold front 3 weeks before it hit, which had given her enough time to get her seedlings under cover, and which had seemed at the time like simple neighborly information sharing, but which she now understood was a man who had been watching the sky on her behalf for months. "You have to understand," she said carefully, "that this is a great deal to absorb. I know it is. I came here to confront you. I was furious. I know. I am still not sure I should not be furious. That's fair. Ezekiel." She said his name, and she heard how she said it, and apparently he heard it too, because something shifted in his expression, the patience thinning into something more unguarded. "Were you ever going to tell me? I was trying to figure out when you would let me." "What does that mean?" "It means I was waiting for you to be ready. And I think," he said slowly, "that maybe tonight, even if it came out wrong, you are ready." Alma looked at his face, the honest, undefended face of a man who had spent 3 months doing quiet good things in the dark for her. And she thought about Daniel, who had been a good man in a different way, a gentle dreamer who had loved her and had also left her alone in a boarding house in Santa Fe with $42 and a piece of land she had never seen. She thought about the 7 years she had spent in St. Louis waiting for the life that was coming, and the 2 years out west that had only been waiting of a different kind, and she thought about the last 3 months on that dry, difficult, beautiful land, which had been the first time in her adult life that she had felt fully awake. Some of that was the land. Some of it, she admitted to herself, was the knowledge that Ezekiel Ashford was nearby. "I do not know how to do this," she said. "I came here to be angry, and now I don't know what I am." "You don't have to know tonight." He reached out and touched her hand, just her hand, his fingers curling briefly around hers in something that was not quite a held hand, and not quite not one either. "Come back tomorrow or the day after. Whenever you are ready to talk, I will be here." She looked down at his hand and then up at his face. "What if I am ready now?" she asked. Something moved in his expression that she had never seen there before, a kind of cracking open that matched what she had felt in her chest a few minutes ago. "Then stay," he said. "I will make coffee and you can tell me how angry you still are and we will work it out." She almost smiled. It was the word work, she thought, that did it. The same language they both used for everything. The understanding that hard things were just problems to be solved if you approached them with enough patience. She stayed. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and a lamp between them, and she told him exactly how the discovery had felt, the particular sharp sting of it, the sense of her independence being observed and gently, carefully trespassed upon, and he listened to all of it without defending himself more than necessary. And when she finished, he told her about Earl Cutter in more detail, the legal maneuvers he had pulled on 3 other claims. The fact that he had a lawyer in Santa Fe on retainer, whose sole job was to identify vulnerable homesteads, and she felt the full shape of the trap she had nearly walked into without knowing it was there. "He is going to try something before your 6 months are up," Ezekiel said. "I expect it will be a challenge to your improvement records. He will claim you have not made sufficient changes to the land to meet the homestead requirements." "But I have done the work." She paused. "We have done the work." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, and I have been documenting it." "What?" "Every time I was on your property I kept notes, dates, work completed, observable state of the improvements. I have a record of 3 months of progress." He got up and went to a drawer and came back with a leather-bound journal, the pages dense with his careful handwriting. He put it on the table between them. "This is your evidence if he challenges." Alma opened the journal and read several entries. The handwriting was precise, almost spare, the language of a man who said exactly what he meant and no more. July 22, 1883. Brenner claim. South retaining wall completed. Stone set to grade, drainage notch included. Soil stabilization evident. Creekside erosion substantially halted. August 4, 1883. East quarter fence completed to county standard. Wire tension appropriate. Post depth consistent. Property boundary clearly established and marked. August 19, 1883. Well drilling completed to 43 feet. Water table reached and casing installed. Water quality assessed, suitable for domestic and agricultural use. Entry after entry, date after date, 3 months of quiet labor recorded in ink. "Ezekiel," she said, "the land office will accept this as testimony. I can file it as a supporting affidavit to your homestead claim." She looked up at him. "You planned for this possibility from the beginning." "From the first week, yes." "Because you knew about Cutter." "Because I knew about Cutter, and because I knew you did not, and because I could not bear to watch you lose what you came here to build." The forbidden word she had been avoiding for 3 months finally surfaced. Not forbidden because it was wrong, but because she had not been ready for it, had not believed she could want it again so soon after losing Daniel, had not believed this difficult, windswept land could also contain this. "I should tell you something," she said. He waited. "I knew you were there. Not specifically, not which nights, but I knew. I would go to sleep and the work would be unfinished and I would wake up and know that it was done, and part of me knew it was you. Part of me knew, and I let it." She watched his face. "That is not the behavior of a woman who wants to be fully independent. That is the behavior of a woman who is smart enough to know when to trust someone," he said. She shook her head slowly. "It is the behavior of a woman who was falling in love with her neighbor and using the darkness as an excuse not to have to say so out loud." The lamp flame was the only thing that moved. Ezekiel set down his coffee cup with a sound that was too careful for the weight of the moment, and then he looked at her and she could see everything in his face that he had been keeping behind that patience, the depth of it, the length of it, 3 months of quiet, devoted attention that she had been receiving without quite letting herself name. "Alma," he said. "I know it is soon," she said. "I know I am a widow and I have only been here 3 months, and by the standards of any reasonable observer this is moving at a pace that is not sensible. I have not been sensible since the day I saw you kneeling beside that well with your knotted rope," he said. "I don't think sensible is what either of us are doing here." She laughed. It came out of her without warning, a real laugh, the kind she had not had in months, and his expression when he heard it was something she wanted to keep. The night went long. The coffee went cold and she made more, and they talked until the moon had crossed most of the sky, and she knew she needed to go and did not want to. He walked her to her wagon, and the night air was sharp with autumn cold and sage, and she turned to say good night, and he put his hand against her face, just once, just briefly, cupping her jaw in his palm the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "I live 2 miles away," she said. I know where you live." The edge of his mouth moved. "Come anyway." She drove home through the dark, and the stars were enormous above the basin, and she thought about love, how it arrived without asking your permission, how it settled in like a well-drilled water source, deep and reliable, and there whether you were looking at it or not. She was back the next afternoon. What followed was a courtship conducted in the particular language of two people who both worked too hard and were both a little afraid of wanting things. It was not roses and formal calls. It was Ezekiel appearing at her fence line on a Tuesday morning and saying he was mending his own fence and happened to have extra wire, and she said nothing, but handed him her post-hole digger. It was Alma arriving at his ranch on a Thursday with a pan of cornbread she had made too much of, ostensibly, though she had made exactly the right amount for a reason she did not need to state. It was conversations that started as discussions of soil composition and water rights, and slowly, without either of them steering it, became conversations about everything else: his family, his dark past, the younger brother he had lost to cholera in Texas 12 years ago and had come to New Mexico to outrun, her marriage to Daniel, the love in it and the grief in it, and the particular guilt of surviving someone who had believed so fully in a future he never reached. He told her about his father, who had built the Ashford ranch from nothing and had been a hard, demanding man who had confused silence with strength, and whose legacy Ezekiel had spent 15 years carefully dismantling inside himself, teaching himself to say things out loud, to name what he felt, even when it cost him. "Is that why you do it the way you do?" she asked one evening. They were on his porch watching the sunset turn the basin the color of old copper. Help quietly instead of announcing it. Partly, he thought. Partly I learned that loud help often has strings. Quiet help is just help. Your father's help had strings. Everything my father did had strings. He was quiet for a moment. I decided I would do things differently. She watched his profile against the fading light. You are very different from him. I try to be. You succeed. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she was learning to read, the one that appeared when something she said landed somewhere important. They were not yet touching beyond the careful, allowable touches of that first night. His hand briefly against her face. The moment she had taken his arm on a rutted road in town and kept it a beat longer than necessary. There was a whole vocabulary of restraint between them, and she both understood and chafed against it, because she was not, by nature, a restrained person. She was a woman who measured well depths with her own knotted rope and drove fence posts alone in the August heat, and restraint was something she practiced when it was necessary, not for its own sake. The Earl Cutter situation arrived before she was ready for it, as threats do. A rider appeared at her gate on a cold October morning with a formal-looking envelope and a manner suggesting he knew exactly what was in it and did not mind delivering bad news. It was a challenge to her homestead claim, filed with the Harlan County Land Office by one Earl Cutter, alleging that the improvements made to the Brenner property were insufficient to meet the requirements of the Homestead Act, that the structures were inadequate, the land cultivation insufficient, and that the claimant, as a widow woman without means, had not demonstrated the capacity to maintain the property as a legitimate going concern. Alma read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and drove to Ezekiel's ranch. He read it standing in his barn, and she watched his face go through several things in quick succession, none of them the patient expression she was used to. There was something harder under there, she saw, something that had been sleeping and had now been woken up. "He filed faster than I expected," he said. "Can he win?" "Not if we do this right." He looked up. "I need you to trust me." "I do trust you. I know. But what I am going to suggest involves bringing people into your private business, your accounts, your records, your work history, and having them stand up in front of a county official and testify to it. That is not comfortable." "Is it necessary?" "Yes." "Then let's do it." The legal process in Harlan County in 1883 was not a courtroom in the cinematic sense. It was a land office hearing, a county commissioner and a land agent sitting at a table in a room above the general store, with both parties presenting their evidence and any witnesses they had. Alma had 3 weeks to prepare. Ezekiel's journal was the centerpiece. He filed it as a supporting affidavit, signed and sworn, and the dates and details were meticulous and irrefutable. But he also organized 3 additional witnesses. One was Jose Garcia, her neighbor to the south, who had watched the Brenner claim's progress from a close vantage and could attest to the visible changes. One was Margaret Holt, the wife of the general store owner, who had sold Alma her supplies and could document the purchases and their agricultural purpose. And the third was the well driller from the South County, a taciturn man named Obed Crane, who brought his own records of the drilling depth and the water yield at the Brenner property. Cutter brought his Santa Fe lawyer, a smooth man named Delacroix who wore a suit that had no business being in New Mexico, and who had a talent for making solid facts sound uncertain. He challenged the journal as self-serving, challenged the well records as potentially referring to another property, and suggested that a widow woman of limited means was unlikely to have accomplished so much without significant outside assistance that raised questions about her genuine independent occupancy of the land. It was this last point that made Alma stand up without having been asked to do so. "I would like to say something," she said. The commissioner looked at her, then at Ezekiel's lawyer, a local man named Forrest who was not smooth but was honest, and Forrest nodded. "The law does not require me to have done every task on my land alone," Alma said. "It requires that I occupy and improve the land in good faith, and I have done that. What Mr. Cutter's lawyer is suggesting is that because I am a woman and a widow, any help I received constitutes evidence of my inability to hold the claim. I would ask the commissioner to consider whether the same argument would be made against a male homesteader who hired workers to help build his fences." She paused. "Neighbors help each other in this territory. That is not a sign of weakness or invalid occupancy. It is how this land gets settled." The room was quiet. Jose Garcia nodded from his bench. Margaret Holt pressed her lips together approvingly. Cutter, seated at his table with his smooth lawyer, looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had underestimated someone and was only now understanding the cost of that. The commissioner took 2 days to deliberate. Alma went home and worked. She could not have done anything else. The waiting would have destroyed her if she had not had the soil under her hands. Ezekiel rode out each day and did not try to comfort her with words, because he was smart enough to know she did not need words. He worked alongside her, stringing a new section of fence on the west quarter that she had been meaning to do for weeks, and the work was its own kind of comfort, the rhythm of it, the shared silence of 2 people doing a hard thing together. On the second evening of waiting, with the fence half done and the sun going down and both of them tired in the same honest, physical way, Alma stopped and looked at him. "If I lose the claim," she said, "you are not going to lose the claim. If I do." He stopped working and looked at her. "If I do," she said, "I want you to know that it is still worth it coming here, doing this, all of it." She paused. "You are part of the all of it." He set down the wire stretcher and crossed the distance between them, and there, beside a half-finished fence in the long gold light of a New Mexico autumn, he kissed her for the first time. It was not tentative. He had been patient long enough and she had been patient long enough, and the kiss was the kind that comes after 3 months of waiting, which is to say it was thorough, and it was honest, and it said everything the quiet nights had been building toward. When they separated, she was breathing differently, and so was he. "You are not losing the claim," he said again. She laughed against his shoulder and let herself lean there for one moment, just one, before she straightened and picked up the wire. "Then we have a fence to finish," she said. The commissioner's decision arrived by rider on a Thursday morning in late October. Alma read it at her kitchen table with the autumn sun coming through the window and her hands entirely steady. Claim upheld. Improvements found sufficient. Challenge dismissed. There was a second paragraph in the commissioner's notes. not legally binding but clearly written with intent, observing that the evidence presented demonstrated a pattern of substantial and consistent improvement to the Brenner property, and that the attempt to challenge the claim on the basis of the claimant's gender or marital status was without legal foundation and would not be given weight in future proceedings of similar nature. She rode to Ezekiel's ranch so fast she arrived before she had fully planned what she wanted to say. He was coming out of the barn when she rode up, and she dismounted and handed him the paper without speaking, and he read it and then looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, unguarded and luminous in a way that made her chest ache. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She crossed the yard and put her arms around him, and he held her with both arms around her back, and they stood like that in the early morning cold, two people who had fought a quiet fight together and won it. And she felt in the steadiness of his arms something she had not expected to feel again at 27 years old in the middle of a high desert with no family and no certain future. She felt completely safe. That night, over dinner at his table, he asked her a question she had not expected. "What do you want to do with the land?" he said. "Not what you planned with Daniel. What do you want?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you have been working towards someone else's vision since you got here. You came because Daniel dreamed it and you wanted to honor that. But it's your land now. What do you want to build?" Nobody had asked her that, not anyone. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything without rushing. "I want to run cattle," she said. "Not the way you do, not a big operation. A small herd, good animals, and I want to do something with the creek." She paused. "The water rights on my section of the creek, if I develop them properly, I think I could establish a reliable water source that would be valuable to the whole basin. Not just for me, for the neighbors too." He was watching her the way she was learning to love, with complete attention. "The creek access is what Cutter wanted," he said. "I know, and I want it used right." She lifted her chin slightly. "I want to develop it in a way that benefits the Garcias and the Holts and the other small claims, a community water arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very good idea." "I know it is." She smiled. "Will you help me plan it?" "I will help you finish it," he said, and his voice had something warm in it, an echo of everything that had passed between them. She reached across the table and took his hand. Earl Cutter did not disappear. Men like Cutter rarely did. They simply adjusted their pressure and applied it elsewhere. And he was still a powerful presence in the county, still running his 3,000 acres, still watching the basin with acquisitive eyes. But the Brenner claim was no longer vulnerable, and the land office had made its position clear. And when Cutter's lawyer attempted a secondary challenge to the water rights question 2 months later, Forrest filed a response that included the commissioner's prior language about gender-based challenges, and the secondary action was dropped within a week. By November, Alma had her first small herd. 4 cattle, purchased at auction in the county seat with money she had saved, and with a loan she had negotiated herself at the bank in town, a negotiation that had taken 2 visits and considerable patience, and a detailed written accounting of her property improvements that she brought to the second meeting, and which had impressed the bank manager enough to approve the loan at a fair rate. She drove the cattle home herself with help from Jose Garcia's eldest son, a 14-year-old named Pedro who handled cattle with a natural skill, and who she paid in cash, and a jar of preserves his mother had mentioned wanting. Ezekiel appeared at her fence line that evening as she was settling the animals, and he leaned on the top rail and looked at her small herd with an expression she could not immediately read. "4's a good start," he said. "I intend to have 20 by spring." "How?" "2 of these are heifers, good breeding stock." She looked at the animals with the particular satisfaction of a person who has made a sound investment. "I have been reading everything I can find about crossbreeding for the New Mexico climate. There is a rancher in Colorado doing interesting things with Hereford and Longhorn stock." He raised an eyebrow. "You have been researching cattle genetics." "I have been researching my business," she said. "Were you expecting something else?" "No," he said, and he was smiling. the full smile she had learned to wait for. "No, I was not expecting something else." She climbed the fence and sat on the top rail beside him, and they watched the cattle settle in the last light, and she thought about how strange and true it was that she had come to this land to honor a dead man's dream, and had found her own dream inside it, sharp and alive and entirely hers. December arrived in Cibola Flats with a cold that had teeth. The first snow came on a Thursday, and Alma woke to white silence and a fire that had gone low in the night and cattle to see to, because cattle did not pause for weather. She went out in the cold and moved the herd to the sheltered south pasture. She had prepared for exactly this eventuality, checking their water and their feed with the focused competence of a woman who had read 3 books on cattle husbandry and then put the knowledge where it belonged, in her hands. Ezekiel arrived mid-morning with a wagon of hay, and she told him she had enough, and he said he knew, but he had extra, and they compromised by storing the additional bales in the linta she had built beside the main shelter, which was sensible whatever the reason behind the offer. He stayed for lunch. And then for the afternoon, because the snow was coming harder and riding 2 miles in a heavy snow was not sensible even for a man as stubborn as Ezekiel Ashford. And so he stayed, and they spent the afternoon by the fire with books and coffee and conversation, and occasional silences that were as comfortable as the conversation. "Tell me about your brother," she said, not because she was trying to open a wound, but because she had been thinking about what he had told her. The brother lost to cholera 12 years ago, and she thought about Daniel, and she understood the particular weight of a person-shaped hole. He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas, he was 23, younger than me by 4 years. He looked at the fire. He was the one with the charm. I was the one with the patience. He could make anyone like him in 5 minutes, and I could not make anyone comfortable in 5 years. He always said we were 2 halves of a proper person." He paused. "When he died, I was not sure how to be a whole person. And now—" He looked at her. "Now I am starting to think I might have found the other half again," he said. "Different shape than before, better fit." Alma felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the snow came down without apology. Christmas in Cibola Flats was a modest affair. The town had a church and a preacher who came through once a month on a circuit, and the December service was attended by most of the local families, and followed by a gathering at the Holt's General Store with cider and a fiddle. Alma went with Ezekiel, and this was the first time they had appeared in town together in a way that was unmistakably something. Not 2 neighbors attending the same event, but 2 people who arrived together and sat together and left together, and the town noticed and the town approved, which she felt in the quality of the greetings she received, warmer than before, more settled. She danced with him twice. He was not a natural dancer, but he was a careful one, which she had expected, and he moved with the same deliberate honesty he brought to everything, and she found it more appealing than fluency would have been. Walking home in the cold, clear night, their breath making small clouds in the dark, he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Not tonight." He looked straight ahead. "I want to ask it properly when I am ready." She knew what he meant. She felt it the way she felt weather coming in her bones before she could see the clouds. "Take your time," she said. "I will be here." He looked at her sideways. "You are sure of that?" "I am sure of very little," she said, "but I am sure of that." The question came in January. He had ridden out in the early morning, which was unusual, and she saw him coming from the window and was outside before he had dismounted, because she was not a woman who waited inside when she could be outside. He tied his horse and took off his hat and held it in both hands in that gesture she recognized, the one that meant he was about to say something important. "Alma Brenner," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She looked at him in the cold, white morning light. "I would like to tell you some things first," she said. He nodded. He was prepared for this. He would have been surprised if she had simply said yes. "I am not going to give up my land," she said. "The Brenner claim is mine, and it stays mine. I have worked for it, and it is part of who I am now, and any arrangement between us would need to acknowledge that." "I would expect nothing else," he said. I want to run my cattle operation as my own business, separate from the Ashford operation, though I am open to shared arrangements where they make economic sense." Agreed. "And I want to develop the creek water arrangement I told you about, the community water plan. That is important to me." "I will help you build it," he said, "every single part of it." She looked at him for a long moment. The sky behind him was the pale winter blue of New Mexico, enormous and clear, and the land was white and quiet, and the cattle were moving slowly in the south pasture, and her adobe house stood behind her, solid and changed in hers. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He smiled, the full smile, and then he crossed to her and kissed her in the cold morning air, and she put her arms around his neck and held on, and the horses and the cattle and the wide sky watched without comment. They married in February of 1884 in the Cibola Flats Church. On a Saturday morning, when the light came through the windows at a low winter angle and made everything gold. Alma wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the catalog, dark blue wool, practical but good, with careful stitching at the collar and cuffs, because she took pride in the things she made. She carried no flowers because the season had none, but Margaret Holt appeared that morning with a small bunch of dried lavender she had kept from her summer garden and pressed into Alma's hands without ceremony. Jose Garcia and his wife Maria sat in the front row with their children. The Garcia family had become her nearest true friends in the territory. Maria, a warm-spirited woman who brought food without asking if it was needed, and who had, over the months, become something like the older sister Alma had never had. Their eldest son Pedro was wearing a collar that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable, and Alma felt a wave of affection for all of them that was close to overwhelming. Obed Crane, the well driller, came and sat in the back and removed his hat and did not speak to anyone, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew of him. The preacher read the ceremony and Ezekiel said his vows in the quiet, certain voice of a man who meant every syllable, and Alma said hers in the clear, direct voice of a woman who made promises she intended to keep. And when it was done, he put the ring on her hand, a simple gold band that had been his grandmother's, and she looked at it against her rough, work-hardened hand and felt it was exactly right. The celebration was at the Ashford Ranch, which was large enough to hold everyone, and there was food enough for the whole town and a fiddle player and a second musician with a concertina, and people danced on the wooden floor of the main room until late in the evening. At some point in the middle of it all, Alma found herself standing at the edge of the room with a cup of cider, watching Ezekiel across the space. He was talking to Jose Garcia, and he was laughing at something Jose had said, a real laugh, and she watched his face and thought about the first time she had seen him on horseback at the edge of her dry well, how he had been a stranger and how completely that category had ceased to apply. He looked up and found her across the room, the way he always seemed to know where she was, and something passed between them across the distance, and she raised her cup slightly, and he raised his, and then someone claimed his attention, and she turned back to the room and smiled at nobody in particular. The practical realities of the marriage were worked out over the following weeks with the same combination of negotiation and goodwill that had characterized everything between them. They spent their nights at the Ashford Ranch, which was the larger property with the better-built house, but Alma was at her own land every day, managing her cattle and overseeing the water development project she had planned. Ezekiel contributed labor and equipment to the water project, but the design was hers, and the decisions were hers, and he was careful about this, scrupulous in the way he was scrupulous about everything important. The creek water arrangement came together through the spring. It was a simple system, a series of diversion channels and a shared reservoir that Alma had designed based on her reading and her observation of the creek's behavior through 2 seasons. The cost was split among 5 families in proportion to the benefit they would receive, and she had negotiated those arrangements herself in a series of kitchen table meetings with the neighboring families. The Garcias took the largest share because they had the most irrigable land. The Holts took a small share for their kitchen garden and the stock they kept behind the store. Two other small claims in the basin took shares as well. Earl Cutter watched this arrangement take shape from his eastern fence line with an expression that Alma did not bother interpreting. The creek was hers, the water rights were registered, and what she did with them was her business. He had lost his chance at the Brenner claim and its water access, and she intended that he would feel the shape of that loss every dry summer for the rest of his tenure in the basin. She did not gloat about this. She did not need to. By the time the water system was complete, in May of 1884, she had 16 cattle and 2 had calved, and the spring grass in the south pasture was coming up thick and green, because the drainage channel she had dug the previous summer was directing moisture where it needed to go. The land was productive and hers, and she stood at the edge of it one morning in the warm May light and felt something she decided to call complete, not because nothing was left to do. There was always something left to do, but because the foundation was sound. She had recently discovered, expecting a child. She told Ezekiel on a Tuesday evening after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the daylight coming through the west window. She had thought about how to say it and had decided that simple was right. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her and she saw the thing in his face that she loved most about him, the way his emotions arrived fully and without armor. "When?" he said. "November, I think. I'm not entirely certain of the timing." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them. "Are you all right?" he said. "How do you feel?" "Tired in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise well." She paused. "Ezekiel, I want you to know that I am going to keep working. I am not going to treat this as an illness." "I know you're not," he said. "I would not ask you to, but I may need help. I will be there." "I know," she looked at his hands holding hers. "I know you will." Maria Garcia came over the next day, having learned the news through the particular communication network of women on the frontier that operated without any visible mechanism. She brought soup and a blanket she had made herself, and a list of things Alma needed to eat and things she needed to avoid. And then she sat down and took Alma's hand and said, in Spanish-accented English, "You are going to be a wonderful mother, because you are a woman who finishes what she starts." Alma had to press her lips together hard at that. The pregnancy moved through the summer like the season itself, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum. Alma worked her cattle and the water system and the garden she had established behind the adobe, which she visited every day even though they were living at the Ashford place, because she was not ready to let the Brenner land go fallow. She was never going to be ready to let the Brenner land go fallow. Ezekiel, true to his nature, found quiet ways to ease the things that were becoming harder for her without making it a production. He shifted his morning schedule so he was always at her land by the time she arrived, which meant the heaviest tasks were handled before she even reached for a tool. He hired a second ranch hand and assigned him primarily to whatever she needed, though the assignment was phrased as general support rather than assigned minding, because he knew how she would receive the latter. He ordered from the catalog a rocking chair that arrived in September and appeared on the porch without comment, and which she sat in every evening after supper, and which she never acknowledged as a gift because they both understood it was one, and acknowledgement was not required. There were harder moments. A hot August day when she was tired beyond what she was willing to admit and snapped at him over something trivial, a disagreement about where to run a new section of fence that was not really about the fence. He had listened and then said, quietly, that they could do it her way and they had. And later that night she had said she was sorry and he had said there was nothing to be sorry for, which was perhaps not entirely true but was generous. A night in September when she woke from a dream she could not quite recall that left her with tears on her face and Daniel's name in her mouth, and she lay in the dark beside Ezekiel feeling the particular guilt of the living, the question of whether it was a betrayal to be this happy, to be this held. Ezekiel woke, the way he always seemed to, with that quiet awareness of her he carried even in sleep, and he did not ask questions, just put his arm around her and held her until the sky went gray. "You don't have to explain," he said in the first light. "I know," she said. "Loving me doesn't mean you stopped loving him." She turned to look at him. He was serious, unhurried, certain. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "Good," he said. "I don't want that kind of love. I want the kind that comes from a full heart, not an emptied one." She looked at him until she could not stand it, and then she put her face against his chest, and he wrapped around her in the early morning cold, and she thought that she had no adequate language for what she felt, and that was all right, because neither of them needed her to speak it. November arrived, and with it the baby. On a cold, clear night with Maria Garcia present, and Ezekiel pacing the front room with a quietness that was the restrained form of a man who was terrified and keeping it under control by will alone. Alma heard him through the walls, and the knowledge of him there was, in its way, the thing that helped her most. The baby was a boy. He came into the world at nearly midnight, loud and angry and red-faced, and when Alma held him in the lamplight she felt something she had no prior reference for, a love that was not like Daniel's love or Ezekiel's love, but was entirely its own category, enormous and particular and fierce. Maria brought Ezekiel in after. He came to the bedside and looked at the baby and then at Alma, and she could see him working to keep his expression steady, his jaw tight with the effort of it. "What do you want to call him?" he said. She had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said, "if you're willing." His breath came in sharply just once. "After your brother," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were not entirely dry. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son. This careful, patient man who had spent a year finishing her work in the dark, and who was now holding the most extraordinary thing either of them had made. And she thought about the morning she had come to his ranch in fury with a letter in her hand. How close she had come to making that about something other than what it was. And she was grateful, with a depth she could only measure backward from here, that she had stayed. Thomas Ashford was a loud, determined infant who grew into a loud, determined child with his mother's practical curiosity and his father's unhurried way of studying a problem before he attempted to solve it. He walked early and talked constantly, and took apart everything he could reach to see how it worked, and Alma considered all of this evidence of excellent character. The cattle operation grew. By the spring of 1885 she had 32 head, a figure that had required careful management and 2 successful calving seasons, and a breeding decision she had made with the Colorado Hereford cross she had researched, which had turned out to be sound. She sold her first significant lot at the spring auction in the county seat and came home with more money than she had arrived in New Mexico with, which she sat with quietly for an entire evening, not spending it, just knowing what it meant. "You look like you solved something," Ezekiel said from across the dinner table. "I did," she said. "Myself," he smiled. "Not by yourself." "No," she agreed. "Not by myself." He reached over and poured her coffee without being asked. The way he always had, and she let him. The way she always did, which was no longer about dependency and had never been about charity. It was just the language of 2 people who knew each other well enough to know what was needed before it was spoken. The water project produced its first full summer of operation in 1885, and it worked. The creek diversion held and the reservoir filled, and the 5 families in the arrangement all had adequate water through the dry season for the first time in the basin's recent history. Jose Garcia, when the summer ended and his crops came in, rode over to the Ashford place with a bottle of good whiskey and a formality of manner that was unusual for him. "My father tried to establish something like this for 20 years and could not make it work," he said to Alma in his precise, careful English. "You came here not knowing any of us and you built it in 1 year." "I had help," Alma said. "You had a plan," Jose said. "The help is easier to find when the plan is good." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The second child arrived in March of 1886. A girl this time, small and dark-haired with Ezekiel's patient eyes, and an expression of extraordinary composure for someone who had been in the world for approximately 6 hours. They named her Clara, for no complicated reason other than that it suited her from the first moment, clear and firm and right. Thomas, who was 2.5 and not yet sophisticated enough to conceal his feelings, regarded Clara with a suspicion that gradually, over the following weeks, softened into proprietorial devotion. He brought her things she could not use and narrated events in her vicinity as though she were his primary audience, and Alma and Ezekiel exchanged looks over his head that contained entire conversations. The Ashford ranch grew, not wildly or recklessly, but with the same deliberate intention that Ezekiel brought to everything. He expanded the herd, built 2 new outbuildings, and added a hand or 2 each year until he had a proper crew of 5 working men, all of whom were paid fair wages at a time when that was not universal, and all of whom stayed because they had reason to. Alma's Brenner operation, as she still privately thought of it, became formally incorporated into the Ashford accounts in 1887, not by loss of identity, but by practical consolidation of record-keeping. And this arrangement was her suggestion, because she was a woman who could change her mind when the evidence supported it, and the evidence was that their combined operation was stronger than either separate one, and that she had built something worth being added to rather than subsumed by. The Brenner land was still hers, the deed was in her name, the water rights were in her name. She went there every day and she knew every inch of it, and it was hers in the way that only things you have fought for and finished can be yours. Earl Cutter sold his operation in 1888 to a cattle consortium from Denver that had no particular interest in small basin politics and no existing grievances to pursue. His departure from Cibola Flats was unannounced, and the town absorbed it the way the land absorbed rain, without ceremony, without waste. Forrest, the local lawyer, told Ezekiel that Cutter had apparently encountered legal difficulties in another county related to a land fraud scheme that had nothing to do with Cibola Flats, and that the Harlan County Land Office had noted his record unfavorably. The details were not entirely clear, and Alma, when she heard this, felt something that she carefully did not call satisfaction, because she was trying to model grace for her children. She felt it anyway. By 1889, New Mexico was moving toward statehood, which was still years off but beginning to feel real in the way that large things eventually do, and the territory was changing. More people coming in, more fences, more roads, more complexity. Cibola Flats was no longer the edge of the known but somewhere in the middle of an expanding world, and this brought both opportunities and losses. The Garcia family expanded their operation significantly and hired workers from the surrounding region, and Maria's easy availability for afternoon visits became rarer, which Alma mourned in the practical way she mourned most things, by adjusting and finding other rhythms. Thomas started school in the town schoolhouse in 1889, which required a daily drive that Ezekiel built into his morning routine without Alma having to ask, though she would have managed it herself, and did when he was needed elsewhere. Thomas was an attentive, sociable student who came home every day with information he needed to discuss immediately, and dinner in the Ashford house took on a quality of academic debate that both his parents found entertaining. Clara, at 3, watched all of this from a position of quiet assessment. She was a child who took things in before she responded to them, who could sit still for extraordinary periods with an object in her hands, examining it with focused patience. She had, Alma thought, her father's fundamental nature. The third child came in the fall of 1890, a boy they called Daniel. Alma had debated this name for months before she said it aloud to Ezekiel, uncertain how it would land, uncertain whether she had the right to bring Daniel Brenner's name into this house, this life, this family that was unmistakably and completely Ezekiel's. She brought it up one evening sitting on the porch in the September warmth, the 2 older children asleep inside, the stars coming up over the basin. If it's a boy, she said, I want to call him Daniel. Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. I think that's right, he said. You're certain? He brought you here, Ezekiel said. He dreamed this land and he sent you to it. Without Daniel Brenner there is no Cibola Flats, no claim, no knotted rope beside a dry well. No you, he looked at her. Of course we should name a son for him. Alma looked at the stars for a while. You are an extraordinary man, she said. I know a good plan when I see one, he said, and she laughed. Daniel Ashford was born in October, quieter than Thomas had been and more restless than Clara, with a combination of features that seemed to synthesize both of his parents more directly than his siblings had, and a personality that emerged over the following months as sunny and determined in equal measure. The Ashford house had 3 children in it now, and was full in the particular way of houses, where people are living rather than waiting to live, where the noise is the sound of something being built. Alma managed it the way she managed everything, with a combination of planning and pragmatism, and Ezekiel was present in the way he had always been present, quiet and useful and exactly where he was needed. They hired a young woman named Rosa, the younger sister of one of the ranch hands, to help with the children 2 days a week, which was not the same as turning over the raising of them, and which Alma was clear about from the beginning. Rosa was 19 and capable, and she and Alma developed a working respect that was, in its own way, a friendship. In the spring of 1891, Alma rebuilt the adobe house on the Brenner claim. Not because she needed it for herself, but because she had plans for it. She made it larger, added a second room, repaired the roof with new materials, and by summer she had it ready. She told Ezekiel what she had in mind one morning while they rode the northern fence line together, a thing they did on the first of every month, a habit they had fallen into that was ostensibly about property management, and was also about the particular pleasure of riding side by side with someone you trusted completely. I want to run a school on the Brenner property, she said, or a lending library, or both. She had been thinking about this for years, moving slowly toward it. There are families in the basin whose children cannot make it to the town school reliably. The distance is too far in bad weather or when the family needs the children's labor. If there were something closer between the town and the outlying claims, you're going to build a satellite school, he said. I am going to explore the possibility, she said. I have spoken to the teacher in town about it. She is interested in having someone capable run a supplemental program. And you are capable, he said without inflection. I learned to read at 4, she said. I had a mother who believed in it. Not every child out here has that. She paused. I want to change that where I can. He rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, What do you need to make it work? She had a list. She always had a list. The school in the Brenner adobe opened in September of 1891 with 7 children and Alma Ashford, née Brenner, teaching 2 mornings a week with books she had ordered from Santa Fe, and a blackboard Ezekiel had built and installed the week before without her asking him to. She had given him the dimensions and the preferred placement and come back 2 days later to find it installed with a precision she had specified, and a shelf he had added without being asked because he had noticed, in her stack of books, that there were more than the existing storage would accommodate. She ran her hand along the shelf when she saw it. She did not say anything. She did not need to. By the end of the first year she had 14 students. By the end of the second, 21. The County Education Board took notice in 1893 and offered her a modest formal budget in exchange for some oversight of curriculum, which she negotiated with characteristic efficiency, keeping the things she needed and giving ground on the things that did not matter, and the school became a recognized educational outpost of the Harlan County District. Thomas was among her students for a year before he aged out into the full town school, and Clara came the year after, and Alma had the particular experience of teaching her own children in her own classroom on her own land, which was not something she had planned, but which felt like the kind of thing that happens when you follow a plan to its logical conclusion and discover the landscape on the other side. The water project underwent its first expansion in 1893, taking in 2 additional families who had settled in the basin's eastern edge, and Alma spent the better part of a summer overseeing the engineering of the new channels. José Garcia's eldest son Pedro, now 24 and ranching his father's expanded operation, worked alongside her and brought 2 of his own men, and the construction went faster than the original had. Pedro had grown into a capable and serious young man who spoke of the water project with the particular reverence of someone who understood what it had meant for his family's survival. He thanked Alma with a formality that was clearly something his mother had taught him, and Alma received it with the same directness with which she received everything. Ezekiel, watching this interaction from a respectful distance, leaned against his horse and said nothing, and Alma felt him there the same way she always felt him, like a fixed point that let her move freely. The 1890s moved through the basin like years do in places where the work is real, with losses and gains distributed in the unsentimental way of the natural world. A hard winter in 1895 took 2 of their cattle and half of José Garcia's small orchard. A wet spring in 1896 made the grass extraordinary, and the calving season better than any they had had. The county road was improved in 1897, and the drive to town, which had always been a significant enterprise, became merely an inconvenience. Alma's hair began to gray at her temples when she was 38, and she noticed it in the mirror one morning and considered it with the same evaluating eye she brought to all information. She decided she did not mind it. It suited the land she lived in, which was not gentle and had never pretended to be. Ezekiel looked at her across the breakfast table the morning she noticed it and said, "You look exactly like yourself." "That is either a compliment or a neutral observation," she said. "It is the best compliment I know how to give," he said. Thomas, at 15, was beginning to develop opinions about the cattle operation that were both informed and occasionally incorrect, which Alma found the right balance for his age. He was going to be a rancher, that was clear, with his mother's instinct for the practical and his father's patience with the long view. He argued positions with the confidence of a boy who had been raised by 2 people who meant what they said, and was usually, though not always, ready to change his mind when presented with better evidence. Clara, at 13, had decided she was going to be a teacher. She had informed her parents of this decision with a specificity of intent that left very little room for discussion, and Alma had looked at her daughter's clear, certain face and thought about a woman kneeling beside a dry well with a knotted rope and measuring the depth before she lost hope. "You will be a good one," she said. "I know," said Clara, without arrogance, just with the confidence of a girl who had been learning from someone good. Daniel, at 7, was still in the process of figuring out what he was, which Alma considered entirely appropriate. He was the family's most sociable member, the one who charmed the ranch hands and made the schoolchildren laugh, and managed, somehow, to be everywhere a moment before anything interesting happened. He had his mother's practical streak buried under a charm he had come by from somewhere neither of his parents could entirely account for, and Ezekiel sometimes watched him with an expression that Alma had learned to read as thinking of Thomas. The year 1900 arrived in Cibola Flats without drama. The territory was still not a state, a condition that would persist for another 12 years, but it had the feel of a place that had decided it was permanent, that had stopped holding its breath and started breathing normally. The basin's families were established, their lines of water and fence and road as intrinsic to the landscape as the creek and the mountains, as though they had always been there, as though the land had been waiting for them. Alma walked the boundary of the Brenner claim on the first morning of the new century. She did this alone, which was not because she wanted to exclude Ezekiel, but because some things were still private, and this was one of them. She walked the full perimeter, all the fences she had helped build, all the improvements that now looked so settled and natural that it was difficult to imagine the land without them. And she walked to the creek and stood beside it, and listened to the water that she had helped make reliable and shared. She thought about the woman she had been in July of 1883, arriving at this land with $42 and a dream that was not quite her own yet. She thought about the well and the rope and the man on horseback who had told her she was digging in caliche. She thought about the wall that had appeared in the night, finished while she slept. She stood beside the creek until she was cold, and then she walked back across the land to where her horse was tied, and she rode home to the Ashford Ranch, which was also her home, had been her home for 16 years, where Ezekiel was making breakfast with the unhurried competence he brought to everything, and Thomas was arguing with Clara about something she could hear from the yard, and Daniel was almost certainly somewhere he was not supposed to be. And Clara's voice had the particularly precise quality she used when she was right and knew it. Alma came through the door and stood for a moment, taking in the room, the people in it, the life in it. Ezekiel looked up from the stove. "Well," he said. She hung up her coat. "Still mine," she said. He smiled. "I never doubted it." She crossed the room and kissed him on the cheek and took the coffee cup he had already poured and set at her place, and she sat down at the table that had started all of it, the letter, the confrontation, the long-building thing between them that had finally broken open on a November night into something she had not known she needed and now could not imagine living without. Thomas said something that made Clara sharpen her argument. Daniel appeared from wherever he had been, mud on his boots. Ezekiel brought eggs to the table and sat down, and the morning went forward the way mornings go in houses, where the foundations are sound, and the water runs, and the work is shared between people who have decided to be honest with each other about what they need. Outside, the January light was coming up over the basin, pale and clean, and the creek ran with the water that Alma's system had made reliable, and the Brenner land sat solid and marked, and hers at the north end of the property line, and the cattle moved in the pasture in the unhurried way of animals that are fed and watered and cared for, and the mountains to the north were massive and permanent and indifferent and beautiful. Every single thing she had tried to do alone, he had found a quiet way to help her finish, and everything they had built together in the dark and in the light, in the silence between them and in the words they finally learned to say, had become a life so complete and full and real that she sometimes had to stand at the edge of it and look, the way you stand at the edge of a country you have crossed hard ground to reach, and simply acknowledge that you are there. She drank her coffee. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the way of two people who know each other past the need for ceremony, they turned back to the morning and everything it held, and they began again.